This presentation was made on June 5th, 2022 for the Journeys class. Thank you for this opportunity to consider my journeys. It's a privilege to look back and present what's come up in my memories. When I listened Faith Journey, I heard some kind of New Testament catechism and testimony. I have little experience in that journey. I found that the meaning of faith includes approaching the sacred through spiritual apprehension. I've been involved in that inquiry for some time. We all know that we're not what we have done in life, but our story can help explain where we are in our journey. You'll see that my story involves history and family and church and a calling and nature and being in inquiry and a little drama and lots of action. I arrived on the scene at Presbyterian Hospital on the west side of Chicago in late 1935. The country was coming out of the Depression as my folks Arch and Gladys Sessions welcomed a third son into their family in LaGrange, Illinois. My father's family had come from England in the 19th century and settled near Atlanta, Georgia. My mother was a Thomas, and her family came from Llangower on the shore of Bala Lake in north central Wales. My great-great-grandfather was a Protestant minister in Wales. The Thomas family immigrated, settling in Chicago in 1882. A generation later, my mother was born at home in 1901. My mother's name, Gladys, was an Americanized version of the Welsh Glawdys. North met South as my parents married and moved into their new Irish hut-style home in LaGrange, Illinois in 1930. The birth of my older brothers required an addition to the house. After my birth, my sister followed. The small house seemed large and was filled with love. Our family life was secure, and I thought at the time exciting. LaGrange was a small town. Everyone knew everyone, and we had free range of the town growing up. During the war years, we had rationing and a victory garden. Each fall, my folks would put up tomatoes using a Foley food mill. My dad was an air raid warden. Wearing his warden's hat and carrying a long flashlight, he patrolled the neighborhood to ensure that there were no lights showing during blackouts. On one occasion, we had an air raid where they dropped paper streamers from a plane. I remember going to the Park Theater as a child during the war to see the Commandos Strike at Dawn, and some years later to the LaGrange Theater, where we got kicked out of the balcony for making too much noise during the movie Young Man with a Horn. I was proud to grow up in the shadow of my brothers, who were both in school. My older brother Bob was adventurous and introduced me to the outdoors. My other brother David was smart and funny and taught me the value of learning. From earliest days, we went to the First Congregational Church, attending the early service as a family, and most Wednesdays going to church dinners. Many of our close family friends were from the church. I joined the church on a Monday, Thursday in 8th grade and still have the small King James Bible from that night. We memorized a lot of verses. I miss the poetic intonations from that Bible and still hold them as sacred. Nothing is better than, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. The newer translations pale in comparison. These verses, like triggered memory visits from my deceased parents, visit me regularly. My mother was a believer in camp as life, so we all went away to camp in the summers. I'm still transported in my mind to Camp Greenwood in Ellison Bay, Wisconsin, where we spent a night on Pebble Beach, awestruck in the wonder of the Milky Way, and counted shooting stars. Several years later, that experience was repeated at Chile Camp in Estes Park, watching the shooting stars by the dam at Bluebird Lake on my first backpack. It was at Chile that I developed a permanent love for the mountains and clear water streams and rain and hailstorms and pushing your body to the limit. High school was a 10-minute walk from home. I loved Latin and German, captained the tennis team, and hung out with the kids that got good grades. We were proud of doing well in school. I followed my brother David to Princeton. I was no longer the smartest one in the class, but I graduated with honors in English and German literature. Working on my thesis was the first time that I was totally consumed in a project of my own choosing. The university had a first-year chapel requirement that I fulfilled by attending 30-minute Episcopal services early Sunday mornings. While I was not enthralled with religion, I was captured by several courses in philosophy, which questioned who we are. Medical school at Washington University in St. Louis was an even bigger scholastic challenge. I worked my tail off and loved it. All doubts about it, whether this would be my calling, disappeared when we started seeing patients. My first patient was a huge Black man at the Homer G. Phillips Hospital in North St. Louis. He had tabes dorsalis from advanced syphilis. I can still remember how nervous I was taking his history and doing my first physical exam and trying to look good. I was testing his toes for proprioception and asked him to name me, to tell me, with his eyes closed, whether I was moving his great toe up or down. His wonderful deep voice boomed in the silence of the open ward. "North," he said. We cracked up, and somehow I joined the club. About this time, I began to attend a local congregational church, seeking comfort and searching for a mysterious something missing. I met my wife, Jan, on a rare blind date, and we were married in the Pilgrim Congregational Church a year later. The adjustment to marriage was like being a freshman medical student. It was clear I was in over my head. We worked on it then, just as now, 61 years later. We've had some fabulous times and some that weren't. We have 3 loving sons. We have a strong polarity in which she grounds me through her German strength and her powerful spirituality. As a surgical resident training, I remember my first slash tracheotomy, where it was up to me whether the patient would live or die. I remember being too busy doing it to be worried. I also learned that not everything turns out well. I saw a young, despondent girl in the emergency room who admitted that she had swallowed a large amount of rat poison. I remember quickly looking up the ingredients in the toxicology book and my amazement that there was no treatment available for this neurotoxin, and this beautiful 20-year-old was going to die. The worst was that she died just as the book said she would, despite all our best efforts. Many experiences in training required that I not take myself too seriously. On a rotation at the John Cochrane Veterans Hospital in St. Louis, I saw an elderly veteran of the Spanish-American War in the emergency room. He was not gravely ill, but he was in a unique category. The VA took special care of older veterans, especially those from the Spanish-American War. There weren't many of those veterans left, so I admitted him. He deserved to be treated with extra care. The next day, I learned that he'd been transferred. He had indeed fought in the Spanish-American War. The problem was that he had fought for Spain. The irony of this was not lost on me. After resident training, I went on active duty as a major in the Air Force. It was the time of the Vietnam War, and we felt fortunate to be stationed in Anchorage, Alaska, as a family. I was an otolaryngologist at Elmendorf Hospital. At my request, the base commander allowed me to treat patients at the Alaska Native Medical Center 1/2 day a week. This allowed me to contribute my surgical skills to a patient population with serious ear disease. Each Tuesday morning, I did 3 ear operations on Inuit children and adults. This was an exciting period, as it was the first time our family was completely on its own in a town on the frontier, where new friends soon became family, and all on $10,000 a year. I re-engaged with nature. I recognized that when I was out on the land, that I experienced a sense of being home. Alaska's wilderness resources are unimaginable. Returning down below to the lower 48, I joined the full-time staff as a surgeon at Washington University Medical School in St. Louis, seeing patients, teaching residents, and doing research in my field of head and neck cancer. In my field, although often we could produce good results, there were patients whose disease was too advanced for curative treatment. In this situation, significant questions arise. What an unspeakable privilege to be a physician in such a sacred relationship with these patients and their loved ones. How long do I have, Doc? After a silence, I would reply, I don't know. No one knows when the apple will fall from the tree. What we can do is make the process as comfortable and natural as possible. I found that patients were empowered when they got that we would go through this together. We were able to have frank and uplifting contact at subsequent visits. At these times, I was helped immeasurably by the poetry of Khalil Gibran. In the depths of your hopes and desires lies your silent knowledge of the beyond. And like seeds dreaming beneath the snow, your heart dreams of spring. Only when you drink from the river of silence shall you indeed sing. And when you have reached the mountaintop, then you shall begin to climb. And when the earth shall claim your limbs, then shall you truly dance. My commitment was to come from this position in my continuing interaction with the patients and their families. After the patient passed away, I sent a brief letter to the family acknowledging my appreciation for what the patient had contributed to my life, and closed a copy of Gibran's poem on death. I became editor of St. Louis Metropolitan Medicine and then Missouri Medicine, the state medical journal, for which I wrote numerous editorials. In these editorials, I wrote about the everyday concerns of physicians as people, as well as doctors. In St. Louis, when our three boys were young, we were active in the nearby UCC church. For some years as empty nesters, we've slowly moved away from the organized church. During some summers, we came out to the Y Camp in Estes Park. I was fulfilling a personal need, as well as recreating with my boys some of the backpacks of my youth, especially one to Crater Lake. Then for 30 years, our family went to a beach house on the Gulf by Santa Rosa Beach, Florida. The Gulf shore is alive with marching seashells and crabs and sand dollars and fish, including sharks. At night, the electric light shows of the offshore thunderstorms are spectacular. One evening, we saw a huge sea turtle laying her eggs in the sand by the shore. Several years later, in the same area, we observed the miracle birth of baby sea turtles and their journey from the nest to the Gulf as they crawled toward the full moon. With my work and family life somewhat settled, I began looking for what's next. My adult life became about evolving from a know-it-all to a student. When I looked at what I thought I knew, it was clear that my knowledge was mostly superficial. This was both exciting and frightening, and it opened up new areas for me to study and in which to be an inquiry. In 1978, my wife and I did the EST training, which was an experience that looked beyond the epistemological domain of knowing to a domain of ontological inquiry. It was one of those times of clarity in life, when you realize that you're doing what you're supposed to do. Rather than showing one how to be more, better, or different in life, the S training addressed the questions, what is the being of human being? And then, what is the possibility of being for human being? Excited by this new direction, I took a leap into this field. Over the next 30 years, I took multiple courses in order to use this in my life and work. I exercised my German muscle by reading philosophers Martin Heidegger and Arthur Schopenhauer. In the early 90s, with my oldest son as guide, I participated in the first of many Arctic canoe expeditions. The Canadian Arctic is one of the few places that one can go into the silence. On the tundra, when the wind is still, the only sound heard is the chatter in your own head, and sometimes even that can disappear. Also, there's nothing like being in the bow of a covered canoe, screaming into a standing whitewater wave as the canoe rises to a 45-degree angle and then submarines downward. That and seeing herds of migrating caribou, grizzlies, wolves, muskox, and even a polar bear make the Arctic an exciting place in which to be as one goes down the river to the sea. I retired from the university in 2000. It took me almost 5 years after that to disengage as I finished writing and publishing papers about the long-term results of my work. It took me almost as long to learn to sleep past 6 o'clock in the morning. Since my retirement, I've become a full-time gardener. Surrounding our home, I have multiple areas where I grow both perennial and annual plants. I've learned a lot, and I have a lot to learn. Plants, like people, thrive where they are well supported. Some need sun and others shade. Some love being in the bare earth, and others are enhanced by nearby structures, like native rocks. All need water, some more than others. Most of my flowers don't last very long. My flowers trigger memories that at times appear real. If a plant is undesirable, you can weed it out, discard it, and replace it. It's much easier dealing with plants than with people. But the most difficult aspect of modern suburban gardening is that I have to share the fruits of my labor, often against my basic charitable instincts, with invading white-tailed deer. The continual construction on the western edges of our county has impinged on their habitat, pushing them back into open spaces to the east. When a white-tailed deer eats your hostas as salad, you have to struggle to calm your murderous impulses. As you can see, a most important part of my faith journey is being in the silence of nature, where the pace of everyday life can slow and the mind can shed its chaos. For me, no day is fulfilling without being on a trail. So I've created an extensive trail system in the woods behind our home. Walking the trails and working in the garden produces a fusion of physical and spiritual comfort and peace. Like many of us, I have a recurring sense of something missing. For the past 20 years, I've continued the inquiry into my place in this journey. I've come up with more questions than answers. The questions point to interesting portals and paths. Where are we in relating to the other that is other? If language is the house of being, how can we use it to close the gap between each other? What if it is not about the circumstances or the content of our lives? What if there's something where you live that is more powerful than your story and its interpretation? Is there a way of being is there a way of being in someone else that is also in me? What if it is about context rather than content? What if we are the same? What if there's nobody out there? What if there's only us? What is the domain we live in that has no content? What's the domain for which there are no words? This is what I call ontological inquiry. It is not easy to language a domain for which there are no words. Literally, what are you studying? I'm studying nothing, as in no thing. I'm studying something that is not a thing and for which there are no words. I say it's a worthy project. When I was a camper at Chile, one of the sayings on the wall was, "Dream big dreams, and then put on your overalls." Several months ago, my wife and I did a 4-day course with Tony Robbins called Unleash the Power Within. The course was on Zoom and lasted 12 hours each day and was shared with 26,000 of our closest friends from 155 countries. It was miraculous to break into small groups and in seconds be speaking with a lady in Switzerland and 2 girls from Dusseldorf. It was not an ontological exercise, but it taught valuable lessons. For instance, when you notice that your energy level is down, how long does it take to increase your energy? It can happen in a heartbeat, and we did it. Tony Robbins is committed to increasing achievement and claims that we can always deliver more than we promise. We love continuing to engage in the educational enterprise. My present view of aging in life is that it can be transformational. I'd like to explain that claim with a story. According to the Greek myth, Sisyphus enchained the spirit of death, so that during death's imprisonment, no human being died. Sisyphus displayed scorn for the gods, a hatred of death, and a passion for life. When the gods freed death, Sisyphus was the first human being that death took. For his punishment in the underworld, Sisyphus was condemned to roll a rock to the top of a mountain, only to have the rock roll back down to the bottom every time he reached the top. While Sisyphus is pushing his rock up the hill, there is nothing for him but toil and struggle. His punishment is to endure an eternity of hopeless struggle. But as the rock rolls away from him at the top of the mountain, as he heads down the mountain, he is briefly free from his labor. He is conscious and aware of his fate. He has no hope for reprieve. He knows that he will struggle forever. And he knows that his struggle will get him nowhere. With such recognition comes the possibility of an acknowledgement of his fate and limitations. With that acknowledgement comes an acceptance of who he is and what he's capable of. The lucidity of understanding his fate can result in a transformation. As Sisyphus accepts his fate, the context of his view of his tragedy can change, and the sorrow and melancholy can vanish. At this time in life, I'm clear that much of my life has been about pushing my rock as a striving, with its obligatory toil and struggle. As I walk down the hill to the next struggle, I'm sometimes aware of the hopelessness of my striving. It is this understanding, this acknowledgement, that opens the possibility for me to choose my struggles when going either up or down the mountain of life. At that moment, there can be a contextual shift. When that happens, I'm no longer captive to my strivings. I'm no longer the victim of my struggles. They no longer own me. In my life, I can choose my struggles as my own. This even allows me to engage with the domain of no life, that is death, not as a sad, dramatic fate, but rather as something that merely happens inevitably. I would like for us to interact with a question. In this stage of the journey that you're on, is there an area of struggle in your life that you can identify that might be available for resolution? This could be something you're putting up with, trying to change. Many years ago, a new colleague came on staff. We had similar interests professionally, but our backgrounds were quite dissimilar. For me, he became a daily source of irritation. Everything he did and said seemed to cause unease and friction. This went on for years. Then one day I made a commitment to myself that Jerry was okay. That the way he was just the way he was, and his actions didn't have anything to do with me. I just let him be the way he was. And the strange thing that happened was that he actually was okay. It did not happen suddenly. There was no flash of light. It happened in the process of life. Nothing had changed. He was Jerry, and I was Don. And we both noticed that we were the same, yet different. This was a contextual change. How we related to each other was different. Today, years later, we have a nurturing relationship. Jerry's not just okay. He's an amazing, powerful friend. So on this day, on your journey, is there something in your life that you're struggling with that you'd be willing to address. Doesn't have to be meaningful or significant. It could be something someone said, or maybe something that's just irritating, such as your body not working the way it used to. Just pick one. That one. My experience is that voicing it out loud can be the first step towards a later conversation for action. This is about languaging it out in the public space and observing it and letting it be, without automatically looking for a solution or an answer. The process is not about nattering and complaining, but rather looking at an issue with an intention. Issues always occur within stories, and the stories are always accompanied by an interpretation. What's the story, and how do you interpret it? Perhaps we could break into groups for this process of describing an issue worth resolving. Our job as listener is to be a transparent, neutral vessel that takes the speaker's issue into our hearts as our own with nothing added. We can see if we're able to just listen, to listen actively, and to get what's being said with nothing added. So let's break into groups. Some final thoughts. This talk of transformative contextual shifts is not just psychological hope. For years, I've used it in my work with practical consequences. For example, in patients with cancer, there are real possibilities. Our discussions all often came down to this. You either have the cancer or the cancer has you. If the cancer has you, then you're a cancer's victim. It owns you. Everything in your life is run by the cancer. If you are someone who is whole and complete and has cancer, then the possibilities are much different. It's all in how you hold it. When patients take ownership of their cancer, they have a different point of view. This alternate way of seeing the situation is empowering. It allows you to live your remaining life with satisfaction. I've had patients who got the distinction clearly. They accepted their fate, and their being and action was dictated by them and not their cancer. This gave them power on how they lived their lives. In closing, I'd like to say that none of this was original with me. These are not my good ideas. All of this has come from those who came before, who taught what they thought was important. It's up to us to listen, to continue to listen and learn, to share what we find of value. That and the silence should help us handle what's ahead. Thank you.